Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all of you to our debate on investing in Europe's 5G infrastructure as a path to growth. Today's debate is hosted by EIF Programming Committee Co-Chair Ivan Stefanec, MEP with the EPP Group from Slovakia, and a member of the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection. Welcome, and thank you very much for taking the lead on this topic at our forum. With the pandemic, everybody has experienced the vital role that advanced communication networks play in keeping us all connected. This critical infrastructure also provides a foundation for a strong recovery, as 20% of the next generation EU package will be directly invested in digital, including 5G recovery funds. Today, we are joined by 5 experts to explore the wide range of benefits and opportunity of investing in Europe's 5G infrastructure. Let's give them a warm welcome. We start with Janette Stewart, who is Senior Spectrum Expert at Analysys Mason, Stefan Schnorr, Director General for Digital and Innovation Policy at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy of Germany, Rita Wezenbeek, Director Connectivity, DG Connect at the European Commission, Jakob Bluestone, Head of Telecoms Equity Research at Credit Suisse, and last but not least, Daniel Pataki, who is Vice President for Policy and Regulation and Head of Europe, Russia and CIS at the GSMA. Thank you all very much for joining us. As always, after listening to our speakers' introductions, there will be an exchange of views with our audience, which will take place in the Q&A session. But we will go there later. And now, without further ado, I'll leave the floor to MEP Ivan Stefanec. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria Rosa. It's really my privilege to open today's event. And first of all, I want to thank all the speakers for accepting our invitation. Today's topic, investing in Europe's 5G infrastructure as a path to grow, is one of the key subjects for the whole European economic recovery. While we are building a digital single market, we have to tackle, firstly, digital transformation of business. That's the topic we discussed a week ago, actually. Secondly, improvement of digital skills. And thirdly, secure and sustainable digital infrastructure. That's the actually topic for today. The objective of this topic are as follows in quantitative terms. In terms of connectivity, it means gigabit for everybody. It means 5G everywhere. In terms of cutting-edge semiconductors, it means double EU share in global production. And in terms of data, edge, and cloud, we talk about 10,000 climate-neutral, highly secure edge nodes. I think today more than ever, Europe must stay connected, and the pandemic crisis has confirmed the vital role of advanced communication networks, which is playing a big role, whether for teleworking, studying, governing, or tracking contagion. The critical infrastructure also provides the foundation for strong recovery as we are in transition to 5G. As we know, the European Commission has proposed its 750 billion euro package called Next Generation EU to relaunch the economy, of which 20% will be directly invested in digital, including 5G recovery funds. This compass will help guide the mobilization of European funds, and in particular to flag 20% of aid from this facility. And the budgetary instrument at the heart of the Next Generation EU recovery plan will guarantee, in fact, 150 billion euro that we are going to invest in next 2 to 3 years. The Commission expects, among other things, that by 2030, all European households will have gigabit connectivity and that all inhabited areas will be covered by the 5G network, which means up 14% in comparison with 2021. If we talk about areas to cover with 5G, we talk about smart production, smart public services, smart rural areas, agriculture, smart urban areas and cities, etc., etc. If we have a look to actual coverage of 5G in EU, it is as following. In European countries where 5G has been launched, Finland has the highest population coverage, over 50%, but most countries are between 15 to 40% level. 5G has really a multiplier effect, and we have to talk about this effect in terms of job creation. For example, Qualcomm predicts that 5G value chain will generate up to $3 trillion in revenue by 2035 and support as many as 22 million jobs. Qualcomm also forecasts that 5G will boost global GDP growth by $3 trillion cumulatively from 2020 to 2035. According to other research, which was made by Accenture, latest economic modeling analysis completed for this paper shows that impact of 5G on the European economy will drive up to 2 trillion incremental gross output between 2021 and 2025. And over the same period, 5G will add up to 1 trillion euro to the European GDP. So multiplier effects will be felt in every kind of industry. For example, for every euro introduced by the direct effect of 5G in information communication technologies, an additional 1 euro will be created elsewhere throughout the whole economy. So wrapping up, if we want to keep our leading global position in the field of digitalization, and if we want to create new jobs for citizens and to build more resilient SMEs and generate sufficient income for national budgets, we have to keep the momentum. And Next Generation EU package is the opportunity to boost our economies via reforms. We have to create an effective and flexible environment for companies to offer them simple access to credit, lower bureaucracy, educate employees, and promote advantages. On the other hand, we should not forget to sensitively in the dialogue with all partners regulate new technologies in a way to preserve our most significant advantage of EU, and this is human-oriented principle in the innovation and the new technologies and also data protection. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for setting the scene for today's debate. Let's give the floor to Janette Stewart with Analysys Mason.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Ivan. I have some slides to present, so just 1 minute while I find those slides. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. So first of all, I would like to thank very much the forum for providing the opportunity for me to join this discussion. I'm Janette Stewart from Analysys Mason's consulting team. Analysys Mason is a global telecoms, media and technology consulting and research firm. So I'm going to be presenting today some highlights from some research that we've been doing recently into costs and benefits of deploying full capability 5G infrastructures in Europe. So we have undertaken recently 2 studies. The first study was on costs and benefits that full 5G deployment brings to some of the use cases that we have already heard from Ivan about across different sectors of the European industry. The second study assessed the cost and extent of 5G EMBB, so 5G mobile broadband coverage that will be provided by nationwide mobile network operators across European markets. So we have assumed a population-led EMBB coverage, and we have considered the costs of that relative to the costs of extending that EMBB coverage into the full capability use cases. We defined 5G as a flexible open innovation platform, which is shown on the slide here. So in other words, we're assuming that 5G supports cross-sector use cases and environments. Those multiple sectors are shown on the slide here. We've grouped into clusters. So we have 4 clusters as shown here: smart production and logistics, smart urban, smart rural, and smart public sector. So the use cases within each sector were selected and are shown on the slide here as being the ones that would typically use the full feature capability that 5G can offer, such as very high capacity connections, massive machine type connections, and low latency communication. So that's such that would be needed to facilitate sort of industrial digital transformation, industrial augmented reality or virtual reality, machine automation, remote piloting, and so forth. So moving on to the next slide and just showing the results of our first study. As a total open innovation platform, we estimated that full 5G deployment in Europe can deliver over 200,000 billion in benefit, and that is around about 50 billion euros of additional investment costs. So that is additional to the mobile broadband deployment, which mobile network operators are already undertaking in Europe. The benefits shown on the slide here also exclude benefits of consumer mobile broadband coverage, which is probably why our figures differ from some of the ones that Ivan just mentioned in the introduction. And we also excluded specific use cases such as road and rail in this initial study, and we then came back to them in the second study. So moving on to the second study. In the second study, we wanted to compare how that additional 50 billion of euro additional cost compares to the total 5G investment cost. So that is the investment being made by multiple mobile network operators in each of the European markets to roll out mobile broadband coverage. So in the second scenario, we looked at mobile broadband provided commercially by 3 or 4 national operators in each market, and we wanted to investigate total 5G investment. We wanted to look at how far that commercial investment might reach, so in terms of population coverage, geographic coverage in different European markets, and using a combination of frequency bands. So we were assuming the European portfolio of spectrum will be used, so 700 megahertz, 3.5 gigahertz, 26 gigahertz, plus legacy mobile bands. We also wanted to look at the additional commercial investment which might be expected to extend 5G coverage using 3.5 gigahertz together with 26 gigahertz to serve specific use cases. And finally, what investment might be needed potentially via public subsidy to achieve a universal geographic coverage using a low frequency 700 megahertz layer. So we had 3 scenarios. A base case, which is the MNO commercial deployment. We have a low frequency scenario, which is the final few percent of geographic coverage. And then we have a scenario C, which is the 3.5 gigahertz coverage footprint with additional 26 gigahertz in high capacity areas, giving us our full 5G capability. So the results of that final study are shown on the slide here. So what we found was that commercial investment being made by mobile network operators in Europe will total 150 billion euros largely by 2025, and that is across the EU 27 market, including also UK, Switzerland, and Norway. So it's actually across 30 European countries. And this 150 billion is the total of all networks in each market. So in each market, we might have 3 or 4 competitive networks, depending on the level of competition. We modeled that this 150 billion euros will provide between about 30 and 60% of population coverage per market. But in geographic terms, that is only around about 10% of the geography of each market. Considering further 3.5 gigahertz deployment, we considered that a further 20 billion euros of investment can extend 3.5 gigahertz coverage. And that is a mixture of commercial investment plus an assumption of a single network, which is publicly subsidized to provide additional 3.5 gigahertz coverage. And then finally, our scenario about the low frequency 700 megahertz coverage for the final few percent was totaled at 4 billion euros across all markets. And that is the capital cost of a single shared 700 megahertz network by market. So that is perhaps why this figure seems so low. It excludes OPEX, and it also assumes a single infrastructure rather than having 3 or 4 multiple infrastructures in rural areas. important to note finally that in the scenarios B and C, there's an assumption that not all of this coverage is commercially viable, and hence public subsidy would be needed. In scenario B, the cost is assumed to be 100% public funded, and then there's a split between the commercial and public funding for the scenario C. The other assumption, which is important, is that the same 5G infrastructure can meet the different requirements of the different use cases. So we're assuming network slicing and sort of 5G standalone networks with virtualization and so forth, so that coverage and capacity can be optimized and tailored to different use case requirements. We're also assuming, of course, that competing multi-use networks would be deployed within the commercially viable areas, whereas in the rural area, the cost is that of a single infrastructure. So with that, I would just like to conclude my comments. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to taking part in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janette, for sharing these interesting studies you carried out in detail. I guess everybody will want to receive them. So we'll talk about that in the discussion. And now I'd like to give the floor to Stefan Schnorr with the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy of Germany.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gibellini, dear member of the European Parliament, Mr. Stefanec. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, and thank you very much for the invitation to our meeting today and virtual greetings from Berlin to Brussels. It's good to exchange views on the important topic of 5G, despite the still difficult circumstances due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Janette Stewart has just underlined the great opportunities and potential that comes with 5G in Europe. And if we look beyond our continent, this potential becomes even greater. According to various studies, the global 5G market will reach a size of up to $720 billion by 2030. Your company's study, Mrs. Stewart, for example, indicates, or as you already mentioned, a potential positive impact on GDP of 70 billion euros for the application of 5G in the area of smart factories, or as we say in Germany, Industrie 4.0. For a strongly industrialized country like Germany, this is of course an important finding. I read this with very great interest. I think interesting fields of application could also be in logistics, construction, engineering, or agriculture, in addition to production. Within the German government, my ministry, the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs, is focusing on promoting 5G technologies in private networks. As you may know, we have dedicated campus networks in Germany, for which we have reserved 100 megahertz of the 5G spectrum. In addition to factories, for example, this includes ports, airports, medical clinics, and so on. In this regard, we are currently also starting a national development program here, as well as a cooperation project with France. Private or campus networks and the associated high level of control over the infrastructure play an important role, for example, when it comes to protecting sensitive data or to fostering security in a broader sense. And security is an important aspect around 5G. We all know that hardware and software used in 5G networks has to meet the highest security requirements. Therefore, the German federal government has taken a horizontal approach. We have decided to significantly increase the security requirements for 5G communication networks, and we designed it to be technologically neutral and, above all, manufacturer neutral. Our parliament, the German Bundestag, will pass the new telecommunication law on this Friday, on which we will also implement the European Code for Electronic Communication, and the Bundestag will pass on Friday a new IT security law. We are now stipulating by law that critical components in public 5G networks must be certified in the future. The German Federal Office for IT Security must issue these certificates. If a certificate is issued, the federal government must then check whether the components are trustworthy. And this trustworthiness check is based on clear and objective criteria. Only when there are no concerns about trustworthiness, the telecommunications provider may install these components in his network. And if it becomes apparent later that the trustworthiness is not longer available, these components have to be removed from the network. With these new rules, we also meet the European requirements, and we have also expressively decided not to exclude any individual manufacturers of components or manufacturers from certain countries, but to check in each individual case by using objective criteria. It is clear that we need reliable 5G security standards that apply to all telecommunication system operators and service providers and their activities under every single EU member state's legislation. Only consistent legal certainty on European level provides necessary level of security. So it's extremely important to have a coordinated European approach. And this is why we support relevant initiatives at European level, especially the EU toolbox. I think that Mrs. Wezenbeek from the EU Commission will perhaps come back to this in a moment. Overall, we see 5G as a key to our continued competitiveness. It will enable new business models and future economic growth. That's why we need to drive this issue forward intensively. This is also because our actions today are already laying the basis for the next generation of the mobile internet. So it's not only about 5G, it's about 5G and beyond. This includes, for example, testing the Open RAN approach, meaning increasingly virtualized systems. Together, European SMEs are already in the position to supply and operate a complete 4G and 5G network from the core network to the radio network to the access network. What must not happen is that we end up in a new dependency due to the strengths of other nations in the software sector through Open RAN, which brings us to an important aspect of sovereignty. Our future requires us to develop and build up the industrial base in Europe for our own hardware, as well as for software, especially with a view to 5G and 6G. To pursue these goals, we are working together with the European Commission and partners from currently 21 EU member states in a variety of ways. One important component is, of course, the important project of common European interest, IPCI, for microelectronics and communications technology. Perhaps we come also to this later. So far now from my side, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive overview, and also for sharing the actions that the German government is taking toward 5G. Now, let's bring in the point of view of the European Commission, which you have just mentioned, Rita Wezenbeek with DG Connect. Over to you. Your microphone, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Very good. So also on my side, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for the interesting study and for the interesting speakers also. So we don't have too much time, so I wanted to basically discuss in my short intervention maybe 4 issues, which is the digital decade, 5G, the RRF, the Recovery Fund, and the CEF Digital Fund. So if we go through these issues, so it has already been noted by many speakers also at other occasions, but during the pandemic, we have, of course, only been able to more or less continue our lives economically, socially, and culturally culturally by going digital. So we consult online with doctors, teachers, and students, and we meet our family and friends in video calls. So we've turned to living our lives largely through our screens, and that only underlines that connectivity as a precondition for digital has become crucial in our life. And in this sense, the COVID crisis has also revealed new digital divides and exposed the dependency of Europe to the various technologies. So this is why on the 9th of March, the Commission has presented a Digital Decade communication, or also the Digital Compass, which sets out a comprehensive vision for Europe's digital sovereignty and leadership for 2030. So it is a vision of innovative businesses, empowered citizens, and one where the EU is a respected and international partner, mastering strategic digital technologies, resulting in an open and prosperous society. It is important to say that this is not a change, but it is a new impetus that accelerates and widens what has already been launched, so that all European businesses and citizens can benefit from digital opportunities. So our strategic framework remains valid. So the communication evolves around 4 what we call cardinal points. It is a digital skilled population and highly skilled digital professionals, a secure, performant and sustainable digital infrastructure, and then the digital transformation of businesses and the digitalization of public services. Now, I was pleased to hear that Mr. Stefanec already mentioned a number of the targets that we have identified for these various areas. So we also present a vision for a sustainable, innovative and human-centered digital society. And that proposes to establish a governance structure, which purpose is in particular to achieve these targets, but achieve them by cooperation between the member states and the Commission. So in this context, we in particular have proposed this digital compass, which basically identifies the trajectory and introduces a monitoring process on the basis of our DAISY index, which allows establishing through a traffic light system whether the member states are on track or not, after which it would be possible to jointly identify ways of remedying situations that are not going so well. In this context, we also propose digital principles that should anchor the European approach to digitalization, basically in order to foster a shared understanding of the digital future that we, our citizens, want in Europe. And such digital principles would be endorsed in a declaration and guide policymakers when they take decisions on digitalization. Now, in this context, it's very important that the EU should master quickly evolving digital technologies. And it should also have the capacity to develop and deploy such infrastructures on its own. So as you know, and it was already mentioned, important resources have been made available. And it's very important that we all work together in a coordinated approach towards these key areas. So in this context, we also propose in the communication the coordination of national investments through what we call multi-country projects. And we propose to ensure alignment with the impetus driven by the Digital Decade communication. So such multi-country projects aim to deploy large digital infrastructures and capabilities and production capacities. For instance, indeed, the Alliance on Microprocessors is a good example of how member states can work together with the Commission, also operating on the basis of an easy-to-mobilize infrastructure. So we hope to propose a policy program before the end of September, and we also hope to have a targeted consultation on the communication in the coming months. So you're invited to participate. This is the digital decade. So then moving to 5G. So the rollout of 5G in all populated areas is a key element of the digital decade. It's the target, it's one of the 2 targets formulated for infrastructure. So as highlighted in the report that was presented today, the full 5G deployment will enable a whole range of new devices provided through IoT. It will offer opportunities on data, cloud, robotics, autonomous vehicles, and we have heard some dazzling figures on what is necessary to get there and also what it is likely to deliver for Europe. In this context, it's also relevant to mention Ethno, who also published in a recent report that Europe can create 2.4 million new jobs through digital transformation. Now, the Commission is indeed working to support infrastructure investments, especially in rural and remote areas. So there we feel that connectivity is at the center of the digital transformation. So the deployment of fiber and 5G infrastructures will provide powerful network capacity to implement smart applications on the basis of IoT, cloud, and AI technology. And that in its turn would be expected to enable innovation of verticals in sectors as agro-food, so agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, health, public service, and smart village applications. So we expect the deployment of 5G can, for instance, allow thousands of local communities to develop sustainable and resilient economic models. Then, on the basis of the RRF, it is very important to note that the discussions with the member states, as many as you know, are in their crucial state, also in view of the fact that the deadline to submit the recovery and resilience plans is expiring by the end of the month. So basically, we are with many member states in a finalization stage of discussing their plans. And of course, these discussions are confidential, but I'm happy to see that almost 2/3 of all member states are already planning to invest into connectivity deployment, with half of them explicitly aiming to support 5G rollouts. In this context, it is important. I mean, it was very good to listen to the presentation of the study and indeed also to the role of public financing, including, I would say, through the RRF. But it's important to also take into account that on the basis of the European competition rules, of course, the state aid rules need to be taken into account. So we are encouraging member states to engage in a proper analysis of these state aid principles. And in this context, I think it was important to indeed, as good as this study is, maybe to highlight a specific point in the sense that member states may have to notify their plans under the state aid rules of the Commission. And in that context, it's very relevant whether there is a true market failure. So I think the figures that have been presented in the study are very useful and helpful to come to an analysis. But what I think going forward will become increasingly more important is to identify, I mean, what is the quality of services that users need and whether there is a network already available that offers this quality of service. So one of the issues there is that in principle, if there is a 4G network, one would say a 5G network is not something that needs to be financed through public sources. However, there may be reason to have a more refined analysis and to see what is the exact quality of service offered by the 4G network and what would be necessary to be offered going forward, looking at users' needs. So an important point I would say to note. One point still in the context of the Recovery and Resilience Fund is indeed also, as Mr. Schnorr was signaling, the importance of the reforms in the context of the Resilience Fund. And there, in particular, we see a role for the connectivity toolbox. So the member states, on encouragement of the Commission, have been working on a toolbox to identify measures how to accelerate the rollout of 5G and also fiber networks. And this has resulted in a toolbox that was adopted and published last month. And presently, the member states are in the process of identifying their own roadmaps, which will identify how they will accelerate this rollout. And one of the issues, for instance, if you talk about 5G, is the relevance of a timely and efficient issuing of spectrum. So in this context, it's interesting to see the timeliness of the submission of the plans in relation to the submission of the roadmaps. So in the roadmaps, we would feel that a number of reforms will be introduced that will help the realization of the plans. Now then, two more comments. I would say it's very important in this context also to mention the CEF Digital Fund, which is another fund that allows the financing of infrastructure. So under the RRF, the plans need to be submitted this month. On CEF Digital, we are proposing to launch calls in the near future. And one of the issues, for instance, under CEF Digital that can be financed is the 5G Communities program. And this would invite 5G deployment for services of general economic interest. And what we see is that, for instance, for these 5G projects of general economic interest, communities could actually be in the driving seat and have a front role in the development of 5G concepts, while 5G is being rolled out in the rest of Europe. So we are preparing the work program for CEF Digital, and we hope to share it as soon as possible when it's ready. And then finally, an issue to highlight also is we were talking about public financing, but of course the cooperation with private investors is also very important. So when we speak about the Recovery and Resilience Fund and the CEF Digital funds, both funds have possibilities of combining their use in the context of individual projects, and also of combining their use with private investors. And we would very much encourage that market parties are working both with public and private investments. So I think this is enough for now, and I would happily refer to you for the next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your presentation. You have touched upon many crucial points, of course, as well the work of the European Commission, of the member states, and the important question of investments. I'd now like to bring in the conversation Jakob Bluestone with Credit Suisse.
Hi, good afternoon, and first of all, thank you, Maria and Even, for organizing this and hosting us, and thanks for the invitation as well. So I run the European Telecoms Equity Research Team at Credit Suisse, which is an investment bank. And I guess as the finance guy, sort of segueing neatly onto the topic of private investment, I thought I'd make 4 points. The first point, which a lot of the participants have already touched on, but I think is clearly very important. 5G and the digitization of the economy is a huge financial opportunity. Whether we're talking about fixed wireless access or connecting everything, or as Stefan alluded to, the sort of transformation of industry, smart factories, this is a huge opportunity. And I think the one thing I'd add is I think it's happening faster than we perhaps would have expected. If you look, for example, just around the world at 5G smartphone adoption, it's around 4 times higher than 4G was at this point in the cycle. So these are things that are happening in real time. It's very hard to put a precise number on it, but I think there is a massive opportunity here. The second point, which I think is sort of the challenge for Europe, is around the returns. The European telecoms industry has very low returns. So if you look at the returns in aggregate for European telecoms, they've been below the cost of capital since 2010. If you look at what's called asset turn, which is basically converting a euro of assets into X cents of revenue, it's actually the lowest out of any industry in the stock market. I think this sort of investor perception of why the returns are so low is really about the fragmentation of the industry and the difficulty of getting scale, but also the regulatory sort of focus on price over investment. As a consumer, it's great that we get some of the lowest price points in the world, or certainly in the developed world, for broadband and for mobile, but from an industrial and a financial point of view, it's the part of the ecosystem that's sort of missing. The third point is, I think, the risk from low returns clearly is that Europe does end up lagging on deployment. I'd say more so on the mobile side than on the fixed line side. Just to give an example, there was an interesting report from OpenSignal last week So they use crowdsourced data for measuring sort of genuine 5G availability. And what you could see was in the US, 5G availability is around sort of 20% plus of 5G or 5G users, whereas in Europe, in the major markets, it's only 5 or 10%. So there is already a gap that has started. Clearly the issue is, how do we close that gap? The fourth point is just in terms of the availability of capital. The money is there. This isn't a question of money. This is a question of returns. Financial markets are incredibly deep. They're very liquid. If you look at the huge fundraisings taking place by infrastructure funds, there's a ton of money available in theory for digital infrastructure. This is very much the case on the private side of the market, but you're seeing it on the public side as well, that there are parts of digital infrastructure where huge amounts of money are being raised. The largest listed independent tower company in Europe, for example, over the last 2 years has raised something like 15 billion euros in equity for an M&A pipeline of 2 to 3 times. So I think the positive is the money's there. I think the negative is just about getting it to the right places to drive investment. A lot of money that's being raised, for example, is about sharing infrastructure rather than necessarily building more. Now, I think sharing infrastructure is a very important part of getting there in terms of connectivity over the next few years. But it's a bit like when you're looking at Uber and ride sharing. You take rides that you probably wouldn't have because you've got wider availability of ride sharing, but you will also go places where you wouldn't go if you have your own car. It's ultimately about improving the utilization of the assets that are there, but also building new things on top. So I think what I'll leave it with is just the point that returns do matter. Ultimately, in terms of mobilizing some of this sort of wall of private capital, it is about creating an ecosystem where there's a good return, both for the infrastructure owners and for the service providers that sit on top. I'll leave it there, but obviously looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your financial perspective that you shared, very interesting. Now, last but not least, Daniel Pataki with the GSMA.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Hello, everyone. So if Jakob was the finance guy, I think I'm the guy who is representing basically the ones who have to make this happen. So the ones who are building the networks and operating them. So I'm the sixth speaker, but it was really, I think, good to listen all the interventions before. So I might, so that they were talking about investment reforms and returns. I think it's most of the things I wanted to say, but I'll try to be short. We've been, I think, all together through this more than 1 year of COVID experience, and the one thing I learned personally in these times that change is something which became the normal. So I wanted to tell you a few things which changed, I think, the past 18 months, but also maybe I started something which is constant. One of the things which is constant is and what I wanted to thank EIF about is the invitation. I think I started to think about, or try to think about, when was the first time I was invited. I was still at BEREC, so it's more than 10 plus years ago, and it was, I think, still Erika Mann. So I think it's really valuable platform what you have, and keep that good work, please, because I think this is really a valuable platform in Europe to discuss policy and regulatory issues. The other thing which is constant from the industry side, which has been said already by Mr. Schnorr as well, and Rita as well, is about reforms. So I think the last time, or 12 years ago, and also the last time when I was here as maybe Director General of ERG or ETNO at that time, I was always asking for reforms. So I think this is one thing which hasn't changed. So if there's one message you will take away from me, is the need for reforms. So with the second message, basically, that without reforms, this, what we've been talking about, will not work. And maybe the third one is reforms. We are talking to policymakers here. Reforms are always much cheaper than taxpayers' money. So I think this is very important, at least from the industry side. So many of you have already said what has changed in the 18 months. Just a few highlights. So when the last time maybe we talked about, we would have this discussion maybe a couple of years ago, then we would say, this is important for economy, this industry, and then infrastructure. Now we know that this is critical. Before a few years ago, we would have said about best effort broadband. Now we know that, business also depends on the home broadband connection, and this is because of the pandemic. The 5G security debate, which Mr. Schnorr was talking about, was not an issue maybe a couple of years ago. And as well as EU competitiveness, that basically some of the speakers has already said that we are, lagging behind, really, in terms of infrastructure also, but also we missed out, as Commissioner Broughton always said, on the personal data battle, and then we have to see whether in the industrial data space or Industry 4.0, is Europe going to lead? And that goes to the sovereignty issue, which is something new, I think, which has changed the past 2 years as well. Where is your European data? Do we own our data? But I think what hasn't changed, but it has just become worse. And I really thank the organizers that Jakob spoke before me, because then I can really tap onto his points about returns. So basically, if somebody would look at the last 10 years of the telecom industry in the US or in Europe, the ones who would have to make this dream make it happen, then this was all about value destruction. So the market capitalization overall of the European industry has been halved the last 10 years, and the US ones was more than doubled. So basically, because sometimes if we say that we are in Europe, the European industry is not performing well compared to other regions, then basically we are getting that this industry has to be blamed. But thanks for Jakob that he was pointing out to the reasons which I will get to the reforms. So my last message before we go to the reforms is what I wanted to say. In the title, it was said 5G infrastructure in helping the growth, but I think it's important to underline that this is much more than growth today. This is all about job, this is all about competitiveness, this is all about security, sovereignty, and also, of course, we shouldn't forget inequalities or helping overcome inequalities. And going back to the policy reforms, I think, if I would take what Jakob said about regulation and fragmentation in Europe, in regulation, maybe there are a lot of things on our list, but I will just cite, I think, 2 of them. One is the spectrum cost and allocation, and maybe how we call it the new subscale players or the set-asides. Mr. Schnorr was talking about that in Germany there was set-aside, and I think Germany is proud of it. Of course, we think that this doesn't help, private investment, and also, building up the promise what is in the digital decade targets. On the second one, on regulation, I think this is going to be an interesting debate in Europe with the DMA and DSA. It's all about the imbalance between within the ecosystem. So this is something I think the Commission is tackling, and there will be an interesting debate in the Parliament in the trialogue. And last but not least, I would mention the fragmentation, the market structure. So these points I think are there in Europe for a long time, the spectrum and the fragmentation, that this market structure, the number of players dogma, or as Jakob mentioned, that focusing on the short-term consumer price effects, we don't think that would help reach the targets what we have been discussing. Thank you very much for everyone, and looking forward for the debate.